Hi everyone, I'm Gary, and welcome to a new episode of Powered by Gem. Now, I'm going to talk today about something that I think is really, really important, that I think is kind of often overlooked as a game master. So this is a video for game masters. It's advice for getting better at that. Now, I always get asked by people who are just starting out, like budding game masters, what do I need to do to like kind of get really good? And you always have that. Anyone who's watching this who's running an all right game, and then someone in their group has gone, I want to do this. They'll ask you, how do you do it? I don't get how you do it. I don't know how, how you... And actually, there's a couple of things that, like any craft, game mastering is something that you can work on, and there are certain things that you can do to get better at it. Now, the thing I want to talk about today is required reading. The things that I think you've got to read if you want to get really, really good at this, especially to run fantasy role-playing games. We like to think that, the mechanism by which we deliver our games is language. It's mostly like we have the dice and everything, we have miniatures and all that kind of stuff's really, really cool. But basically, it's not a war game. It's not a board game. Actually, the real crux of the matter is the players say something to you, and then you make a kind of sensible decision, and you convey the response to that back to them in language. And therefore, the language that you use and the ideas that you've been exposed to are really, really important. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things that I think you absolutely need to read that will give you the vocabulary, not like literal vocabulary, as well as the vocabulary of ideas that you need to kind of do really well at this, to get better at game mastering. The things that you will definitely draw on in a really practical way. Because I think reading is really, really important. I think it's one of the few things that massively improves our quality of life. I think if you're going to do anything, game mastering or anything, you've got to read around the subject. Now, I'm assuming if you're watching this, you've like read Lord of the Rings, you've read kind of like a lot of the really, really popular fantasy series. And I'm going to go through a couple of things. There's a couple of weird ones in here that I think are going to be interesting. And then there's a couple that I think you just kind of have to read. And we've got to start with the most obvious one. So the most obvious one is this Conan the Barbarian, Conan of Samaria, Conan the Sumerian. This is a collection that is it's a glance copy. You can get it this kind of like fake leatherette thing. It's awesome. It's got some like nice Russ Nicholson art throughout it, and it's got everything Robert E. Howard ever wrote about Conan. Now, why is Conan important? Well, Conan the Barbarian is kind of like the source of it all. It's pre-Tolkien. It's a kind of adventurer going into tombs and crypts and forgotten places and jungles and fighting against kind of like monstrous powers and evil sorcerers. It's so important. And what Robert E. Howard manages to do, the author, is he kind of paints these enormous vistas of imagination just with a couple of lines. I often hear people say that it almost reads like it's written like a Western, even though it's fantasy. And I think that's really, really kind of true. The thing about it is that we look at people like Gary Gygax, the one of the original co-authors of Dungeons and Dragons, and he cites this as one of his biggest influences. That's a reason, right? There's a reason that the format of our adventures take that format. The idea of we're a group of individuals who are kind of roguish, kind of heroic, going into forgotten places, going into tombs, going to crypts, going into abandoned fortresses and ancient jungles and forgotten cities, and recovering treasure. And magical items and facing off against kind of like horrible things. And this is where it starts. Ian Fleming, who wrote James Bond, he said of Eric Ambler, who also wrote kind of like early spy fiction and early kind of like thriller fiction. He said of Eric Ambler, Ian Fleming said of Eric Ambler, he is the source from which we all drink. Like he's the source of like thriller fiction. And Howard is our source as game masters. He is the source from which we all drink. And I can't convey enough to you how important it is that if you want to get really, really good, if you want to get really good at game mastering, if you want to have a sense of the narrative beats and what people are really kind of going for this kind of escapism, this is what you need to read. Right? You need to read The Eye of the Dragon. You need to read The Tower of the Elephant. You need to read The Queen of the Black Coast, because they're so important. And they're kind of like the foundational text for everything. So, and you'll always have this moment. It's set in the mythic past, right? It's not set in a kind of true, kind of like secular fantasy. It's set in an imagined kind of past between the time the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the kind of civilizations that we know now. And you're reading it, and you have this a little bit if you read H.P. Lovecraft, the great kind of like horror author who's writing the same time as Howard, and they're good friends. You have this sense that, oh, maybe this kind of stuff could have happened. It's not just escapist fantasy. But if you want the kind of truest form of sword and sorcery fantasy, you've got to start with Robert E. Howard. Conan is the fantasy of will, right? I think that if we were to look at Conan the Barbarian, like really two-dimensionally, go, oh, you know, there's this guy, he's got his rippling musculature, and like, oh yeah, that's why we can see why we might want to beat him. But that's not what makes this character appealing. What makes him appealing is the fact that he can act out his will in the world through pure kind of force of will. Like he can act out, he can get the thing that he wants to be pure force of will. And that, to some extent, underpins a lot of the fantasy that our players want, right? They want to be able to achieve things and feel like they've done things and stopped monsters and collected things and become more powerful because they're good enough to have done that. So read Conan, right? I mean, the video could end there, right? You just got to read Conan. But let's have a look at some more. The next thing I would recommend is something a little bit different. I recommend A Troll Slayer by William King. This is the first novel collection of short stories in a series of Warhammer novels called Gotrek and Felix. It follows a doom-seeking dwarf who's trying to kind of atone for some terrible sin by seeking death against terrible monsters, and his human companion, who is kind of kind of us, right? We don't really get who Gotrek is, but we get Felix. We get Felix's thoughts. And the reason I recommend the first one is not just because it's the first one. It often gets a bad rap, but actually it's a collection of short stories. It's not a novel, and you see all these kind of grimdark fantasies, these kind of like slightly heroic, kind of near to the knuckle fantasies. There's some brilliant ones. There's ones where they're fighting cultists and mutants. There's ones where they're like an ancient dwarf hold. There's ones where they're in the middle of cities. But what's good about it is that this establishes the tone for so much that is to come in terms of grimdark fantasy. And it establishes so much that is to come in terms of game fantasy. The kind of fantasy, and that's important. We like to think that we like folkloric fantasy, we like grimdark fantasy, we like things like, Sapkowski with The Witcher, but actually, these two, this is what you should read this, just because it's short stories. It introduces these characters, but each of the stories is really kind of gamist. Every single moment you can kind of see them happening in a role-playing game. So why wouldn't you read it? Now, the next one I'm going to show you is a bit of a weird one. I watched a video a couple of years ago by Hank Infernale over at Runehammer, and he was talking about his required reading, the things that he thinks you should read. He also mentions Conan, and he's right, and everything that he does is brilliant. And one thing he recommended that was really weird that I went away and read and thought, oh, that is actually really, really helpful, is this. This is the strangest one in the list that I'm going to go through, which is 101 Things I learned in architecture school, but I'm Master with Frederick. Now, Frederick is a lecturer in architecture, and every single page is just kind of like a little tip on things that he learned, and it goes through how to kind of like lay out space so that it's rewarding to move through. He talks about interesting design in terms of like where you would put the doorways in a room to make it seem realistic. So if you're a simulationist game master, if you like your dungeons to make sense, in a very literal, in a kind of like, in a very literal sense, you want them to kind of be coherent and the kind of place that would actually be made, which, you might not be, but you might be. I am. I would recommend this, just because he tells you things like that, like how to lay out space, what's dynamic space, what's non-dynamic space. He talks about negative and positive space and how you kind of, even if you just read the first kind of 10 or so, let's say there's 101. If you read the first 10 or so, he talks about his conception of space. Now, as game masters, we are always describing space. It's actually something that we do all the time, especially if you're like us in your fantasy game masters, you're describing dungeon rooms, right? You're describing adventure sites. So, and you're not just designing them like on a map so that they make sense, but you are also conveying them to the players in a way that is compelling but also coherent. So even if you only read the first 10 or so, I would really, really, really recommend this, just for his conception of space and how he talks about the crafting of space and the language of space, and yeah, it's really, really helpful. And then a couple of other things are really useful. I really like there's a couple where he talks about how to kind of foreshadow the conclusion of traversing a particular space and why that's interesting. And that can definitely work when designing dungeons and when designing adventure sites. So yeah, definitely read that one. Next, and let's go back to the big black books actually. So this is Jack Vance. Jack Vance's magnum opus, Leoness, is another one of those kind of Golansk black books. Now, I don't necessarily recommend reading Leoness. You should do, because it's really good, but you definitely have to read Vance. Jack Vance, he's also listed in Appendix N, the first edition, DM's Guide, Gary Gygax's Influences. it's just brilliant. His prose is amazing. His language is phenomenal. You read it, you learn loads of new words, you know, like viand and cantrap, and you're like, oh, well, I have no idea what that means, but I'm going to go look it up. And then you drop it into the game, and the player's like, oh, wow, what are you talking about? And you're like, oh, this. He has two kind of big fantasy series. Lyonesse follows a kind of Atlantean island off the Bay of Biscay. It's brilliant. It's kind of like fairies meets Game of Thrones. It's like wonderful meets kind of like wizarding jewels. This was more formative for me and my conception of fantasy than anything Tolkien ever wrote. And Tolkien's also good. But this is just brilliant. It's 3 books, Lyonesse, Soldier's Garden, The Green Pearl, and Madook. But his other series, which was probably more of an influence on D&D, was the Dying Earth series. And what that does is it conceptualizes a future world, 1 billion years in the future, when 1,000 empires have risen and fallen on Earth's surface. The sun's about to go out. The continents are totally different. Mathematics have become indistinguishable from magic. So it borders into science fantasy. But I'll be perfectly honest, it's kind of more fantasy. It follows a series of picaresque characters, like roguish characters, traveling this dying world, this apathetic, kind of slightly psychedelic world. But if you want to understand the way magic works in D&D, you've got to get Vance. You've got to get the Dying Earth. If you want to understand how magic items work and why they're so strange and why they're all named after things and why the spells are all like Bigby's hand, freezing hand, or whatever it is, all those kind of like weird things, you got to read the Dying Earth. You got to read Vance, and his. The first book in that series is, again, it's a collection of short stories, whereas the others are novels. And the first book, it's just wonderful, right? You have all these kind of slightly interconnected stories that are set in this kind of like weird, kind of post-historic, nihilistic fantasy world. I'm just like, wow, this is just great. Like, you want to read something that just like bounces off the head in terms of like creativity, you just need to read that. Vance is his prose is second to none. There's only one other author that I'm going to recommend that I actually think writes even better than Vance. But Vance is just like wonderful. You should go and read Vance. Next thing, I'm going to actually recommend something different again. So a bit like this is a bit weird. This is a bit weird. This is Simon Armitage. He is the poet laureate. He's the national poet for England, for the UK when I made this video. And what Simon Armitage does, what this is a translation of, is Thomas Malory's Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur. So this is a long poem. It's a narrative poem that tells about the King Arthur's life, right? His rule and then his eventual death. That's what it's called, The Death of Arthur. It's a seminal piece of English literature, but it's also so important if you want to understand chivalry, if you want to understand folklore, if you want to understand like how knights interacted and or at least that someone's conception of knighthood, Thomas Malory's conception of knighthood. And it wasn't until I read this and then Arthurian literature generally, things like The Once and Future King by T.H. White, I didn't know what pathos was and what it felt like until I read the Arthurian myth cycle, right? We like to think I think that King Arthur stories are sometimes seen as a little bit like Westerns. They're a bit old-fashioned. And actually, this will give you, even though you might find it a slog because it's poetry, and not everyone likes reading poetry, but I would recommend it and stick with it. And even though it's pretty thin and there's not that many pages, there's not many words on each page, it will give you not just vocabulary for description. It won't just give you vocabulary of ideas, which is what Vance is doing. And Howard and some of the others, it will, and Frederick, they're giving the vocabulary of ideas. This will give you the vocabulary of feeling, the vocabulary of emotion, what it means to be an adventurer on a quest, and how that influences oneself. And it will just make your descriptions of self so much more convincing at the table. So why wouldn't you want to read it? Why wouldn't you want to be kind of seen as interesting and developed, and have your characters and your NPCs be emotionally sensitive, and not just emotionally sensitive, but emotionally engaging and convincing. And the last one, back to fantasy. This is another Appendix N author, so I feel like I kind of sandwich the weird ones in between the kind of the classics, the things that I think you should read that are not Tolkien. So Howard, Conan, Vance, either Lyonesse or Dying Earth, and then lastly, Fritz Leiber. This book is Swords and Deviltry. This is the first book in his story about his two picaresque rogues. The reason we have rogues are these two characters at all, really. His two roguish characters, Farfred and the Grey Mouser. This kind of like tall northern barbarian Farfred and his kind of like slightly preening, slightly cynical little friend, the Mouser. And together, every single story, they start, they got no money, they're like, we don't know how we got into this situation, but it's like every single story, there's like dozens and dozens of short stories. They're fighting sorcerers and elder things and, you know, creatures from beyond the veil all the time, and they're kind of trying to outsmart them. And you know, you'll find yourself reading this and genuinely laughing, because this is one of those sources from which we all drink. Liber invented the phrase, it coined the term sword and sorcery, and along with Michael Moorcock, along with Robert E. Howard, he is one of the grandfathers of sword and sorcery. You should read Swords and Deviltry. There's only 3 stories in this. The first one is the Snow Women, and that tells the story of like Fafred's kind of like backstory before he meets the Mouse. There is the Unholy Grail, which is the same but for Mouse, and then there is the absolutely brilliant, the absolutely kind of like, oh yeah, like give me more of this, is Ill-Met in Lankhmar, where the two characters meet. I think it's the best description of a night out on the town that anyone has ever written. You have these two characters, they meet each other, they've got these terracotta jugs of sloshing wine, they introduce their girlfriends, they make an excuse to kind of go to the pub, like it's brilliant. And obviously, you know, there's also, you know, like a rat demon that eats the women, and they've got to kind of break into a thieves guild, all this kind of stuff that you would expect on any great British night out. So that is why you should read this. All of these, I'll probably do another one of these, because I do really think that reading is really, really, really important. The only way we become more interesting as people and more proficient at anything that we're going to do, but especially game mastering, is through reading, through kind of grappling constantly with new ideas and new vocabulary and new concepts. And I think that these things would really, really, really help. So I'm always really interested to know what other people are reading and what other people think would help game master better. So if you have anything, please drop it below and let me know if you think I've missed something really, really obvious, that to be a good game master of a fantasy role-playing game, you absolutely must read. But otherwise, I will see you again later. Thank you.